Center for Security Policy. The topic is the agony of the empire, how neocolonialism, revisionism, and ressentiment challenge democratic civilization. And yes, I have looked up what ressentiment means, because it's not often that you encounter this word. In order to put the participants as soon as possible into equal positions and not to make someone wait too long for the chance to voice their opinions, my first question to you, I'll ask to answer within 30 seconds each. And the question is, please state right at the start of the discussion the main message with which you would otherwise have finished the discussion. And the first to answer is David Stulik. 30 seconds, David. And please use the mic.
I will not use the language of a former colonial empires. I will not speak English. I will switch to Ukraine if possible. Я хочу краще українською. Я би почав з того, що всі імперії мають свій час існування і мають також свій пік занепаду. І зараз ми дійсно є свідками історичних подій, коли одна із найбільших імперій розпадається. Цей процес не можна відмінити, хоча багато людей в Західній Європі, в Західному світі вважає, що це є небезпечно і що ми мусимо робити так, щоб Росія не розпалася. Але я думаю, цей процес почався, і тут Україна є таким каталізатором цього процесу. І я так заключу.
Thank you very much. Botakoz Kassymbekova, your 30 seconds start now.
Okay, I'll experiment. I would say that Ukraine and Ukrainian society and discussions about Russian colonialism and anti-colonial struggle and decolonization in Ukraine, I think there is a potential to make it a global discussion, and one should really reach out globally. And I think that Ukraine can become really a global place for all kinds of discussions. So it's not only kind of a Ukrainian question, it's a global question. And I think I hope that Ukraine will become one of the centers of thinking, of policy making, and of hope for the better future globally.
Thank you very much. And Andriy Dakhniy.
Ну, я, можливо, висловлюсь навздогін тому, що проговорювалося. Я думаю, в першу чергу треба розуміти, що час імперії минув в 20 столітті, так принаймні нам здавалося донедавна, але 21 століття, принаймні зараз ті процеси, які відбуваються, вони мають бути усім колективним заходом, Україною і іншими країнами, які рухаються в цьому фарватері до руйнування цієї останньої і жорстокої імперії.
Thank you very much. Now there will be a rather brief exchange of opinions and extrapolation of the starting messages. But before this, I would like you to meet two people who are probably one of the most important here. They are microphone operators. Where are you? Please, we said that you will show yourself, and so that people. Okay. Anyway, there will be two volunteers with microphones, and when the floor will be open for questions, you may signal either to me or to them, and then ask the question. My request is don't try to snatch the mic from the microphone operators, all right? And I instructed them not to give up the microphones to anyone who wants to pull forward the question. I'll tell you a personal story. When I was something like 15 or 16, the school, which was situated next to my block of flats, they have been undergoing different checkups all the time, and especially their library. This was a traditional, very good Ukrainian language school in Kiev, and of course they were under constant surveillance. So commission after commission would come to the library and say, this book has not to be here. It poisons the conscience of our school children and so on. And they demanded the literature to be surrendered to the authorities. However, the teachers and librarians did not want to do this. They were demanded to give a certain number of copies or a certain weight. They measured the books in their weight. So they would buy at their expense some stuff more or less of communist or socialist orientation, give this to the commission, but take the banned literature to the yard and put there in neat stockpiles. And of course, when I and other girls and boys from our house saw this, we would come down and leaf through the books and take them back home. And this was how I first read about colonialism in relation to the Russian politics. Because in the lesser Soviet encyclopedia published in 1932, in the article Ukraine, it said, in 1654, after the collusion between the Ukrainian nobility or Cossacks and the Russian Tsar, Ukraine found itself under the colonial rule of the Russian state. However, not a single publication that I saw that was older than 1932 mentioned Russian colonialism. So this was my first encounter with this term. My question to you is, when, if you can remember, you first heard or read or arrived on your own to the conclusion about the colonialism and imperial nature of the Russian policies, and how the idea, the perception has changed over the years, and what do you think is the pivotal essence of this term now? And we'll start from Botakoz Kassymbekova. And serious research shows that the span of listeners' attention does not exceed 7 minutes.
Well, I have a very short answer. Well, the first one, I remember as a student, I was reading a text how after the the revolution in Turkestan, in Central Asia, in the government, all of the local people were excluded. So for me, I remember I highlighted that and I asked, what is this? So this was kind of the first one. And the second one was when I read Frantz Fanon, and I remember I started shaking, and I remember all the goosebumps on my skin because I asked myself, how could a kind of French Algerian so perfectly and precisely describe my experience? So these were kind of two, I mean, this is something that comes up to my mind immediately. But of course, kind of retrospectively, I understood my life while I started studying Soviet experience and Soviet colonialism. I can talk about it later, but this is the direct answer to your question.
But before you get the chance to talk about this later, how widespread are feelings like yours among people in Central Asia and Kazakhstan? And what, to your mind, is the distinguishing feature of Russian colonialism compared to other colonialisms?
So I can take 7 minutes now, or I mean, I can talk about the. So usually, and this is one of the questions that comes up very often in conversations and scholarly and not scholarly conversations about Soviet colonialism, because for a lot of people this doesn't make sense. Soviet Union presented itself as anti-colonial. And the first thing that people think about is the British colonial rule in India. This is kind of the standard comparison that people make. And then they say, well, it doesn't really make sense, because if you look at, for example, I don't know, Tbilisi, I mean, it's not really a place that you can compare to many different kind of colonial peripheries. But I think kind of a colleague of mine and we kind of differentiate between overseas exploitative colonialism and settler colonialism. And there is a kind of settler colonial studies that make this differentiation. And they explain, and this is kind of the settler colonial experience, kind of there are universal things to that, which we argue really explain the Soviet settler socialism. And the difference is between the goal of exploiting labor and gaining territory. And that's kind of the major difference between labor and territory. So in overseas exploitative colonialisms, they function through things like racial segregation, two different legal systems you have for the metropole and for the colony, et cetera, et cetera. For settler colonial mechanisms are different because the aim is not labor but territory. So what you do is that you, it's called the logic of extermination, elimination. So what you do is that you eliminate people physically. So settler colonial empires are genocidal. So it's extermination of people is very important. Second of all, deportations is a classical kind of also feature of settler colonialisms. And the third one, in comparison to overseas kind of exploitative colonialisms where you do racial segregation, and it's called kind of among historians the rule by othering. In settler colonialisms, assimilate, and they say that, so assimilation is kind of cultural extermination, and the idea behind assimilation is that you need to eliminate, it's called sovereign capacities, so that people don't claim their land back. So in territorial colonialisms, the aim is all your strategies and mechanisms aim at achieving a state where the local population doesn't claim the land back. So once it assimilates, it associates more with the colonial center, for example, Petersburg or Moscow, and not with itself. And once it kind of forgets the language, etc., etc.
Thank you, Botakoz. Thank you very much. And the same question goes to Andriy Dakhniy.
Дякую. Я хотів би в першу чергу відповісти на вашу репліку з приводу давнього спогадку.
About the memories of yours in the context of colonialism and reading of some books or ban on reading some books. I was born in the town of Stray, Lviv region, and when I went to school, I was always taking one in the same way. And on my way, I came across the school, which was well known back then because it hosted the Museum of the Red Cossacks. And to tell the truth, for a period of time, I didn't know what it was. I had some idea, but these were some hidden ideas. And I heard that Stepan Bandera in the 20s actually studied at that school. This is a very bright example of taking this through your personal experience. Because you come to understand that this colonial heritage was perceived as something taken for granted. It was only in high school that I learned about the other dimension of what was happening in that very building. Of course, everything has changed over this period of time, but there was some transitional period everybody is familiar with, I guess. It was colonial and then post-colonial and then independent period or independent status of a certain culture in a certain country. And what Botakoz has mentioned, I would like to also comment and to add my ideas concerning this Kazakh topic, though I'm not an expert in this. It seems to me that the most recent history, the late years of the Soviet Union and the recent Kazakhstan are also a kind of a transition period. As far as I know, the authorities of Kazakhstan at that period of time were ethnic Russians, and then only starting with Kunayev, the new page in the history of Kazakhstan was launched. And then it was Nazarbayev who is perceived as a transitional figure. Again, this is only my idea related to this ethnic turning point when a certain empire gets broken. Because, of course, the empire always relies on the people coming from the ethnic people. Maybe that's not a very representative example, but anyway, here what I would like to tell about books, Andriy. The book that really changed me a lot as far as perception of colonialism is concerned is, of course, Ivan Zuba's book, Internationalism or Russification. This is exactly the book which, I guess, gave a lot of ideas to a lot of people and changed their ideas of how, under the mask of internationalism, Russification policy was being implemented. And we know that this is not only about the Soviet period Ivan Zuba is talking about in his book, but that's also about the more ancient history. And we could discuss how this was happening before the Soviet Union, in the post-Soviet period. That's a subject for discussion, but let me remind you the ending of the cholera plague, Albert Camus' work, when he said that the bacilla of cholera is never dying, and this bacilla of the Russian cholera turned out to be really ever living. And in the 19th, in the Yeltsin period or in the end of the Gorbachev period, it didn't seem to me that it's really possible. I perceived it as a kind of a phantasmagory. But the cold shower was the year 1993, when at the election in the parliament we had Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who actually won. It seems to me that this came as the first alarming signal showing that unfortunately this story is not yet over, because this bloodless transition looked to be something inevitable, but it appeared that this was just a matter of time when this phantomic pain of the empire will be revived in the Putin regime.
Your story, and also a perspective of colonialism and imperialism from the European values point of view.
Я вас трішки розчарую, бо в Центральній Європі
I will probably make you a little bit disappointed, because in Central Europe we are not talking about Russian colonialism as a notion, and I heard about it, or actually read about it for the first time when I was looking through Ukrainian resources. Because in Central Europe we used to be a part of the socialist camp, but we did not perceive the Soviet Empire. Well, we perceived it as the empire, but we didn't feel that we were a colony. We have even some somewhat arrogant attitude to Russians, because we knew what their social development and economy were like, and we found ourselves a little bit superior than they were. And we also knew that we were, in a way, exploited, used, because thousands of tons of the Czech uranium were imported to Russia, and then they took it from Kazakhstan, and I was born 4 years after 1968, so we didn't have any single illusion that this Russian colonialism did exist. But anyway, we did not consider it through the prism of colonialism. All the more in Western Europe. They don't view Russia from this point of view, from the point of view you are watching at it now, or the other nations of the Soviet Union are watching it. And you need to really make a lot of clarifications, not for Ukrainians, but for other nations as well. I think that partially the Baltic states' representatives can consider themselves to be colonies, but these were much more developed economies and societies than the metropoly then occupied them. So I'll probably disappointed you a bit, because when we speak about colonialism, it's mostly about French, English, Portuguese, Spanish colonialism.
You have disappointed us. You have rather drawn our attention to some new aspects of the discussion. And of course, it is indicative that Botakoz mentioned the British policy towards India. I immediately thought, what about the French policy towards Africa or Polynesia or all this kind of stuff? But the Russian colonialism, the Russian imperialism chooses the main enemy. Now it is the collective West, so to say. In different times it was either Britain, sometimes, well, Germany, obviously, and so on and so forth. It is time already to open the floor to questions from the audience. Anyone? And no? Then I have a number of questions. This was, I would say, mentioned in passing during some of the introductory speeches, but the strength of the Soviet or Russian colonialism is infectious. And to what extent do you think we, as Ukrainians, or other people in the former Soviet or Russian colonies are infected with a desire to create new empires, smaller ones, on the debris of the huge Soviet or Russian empire? Who wants to start? Mr. Dakhniy.
Я поки не готовий, чесно кажучи, відповісти на ваше запитання, але я хотів відреагувати на висловлювання колеги з приводу колонізаторської політики і ставлення народів до імперської там політики і імперського наративу.
It seems to me that not everything is that clear and one-dimensional here, because when Russia was trying to invade Ukrainian lands, in the cultural sense, Ukraine was normally on higher positions. And for me, for the history and philosophy, a very good example is Grigory Skovoroda. In the 19th and even in the 20th century, he was also called the Russian Socrates. It's of course true that the empire is always trying to assign to itself the achievements of the colonialized nations, but Russians in the 19th century didn't have any figure to compare in any sense with Grigory Skovoroda, the philosopher. So I think that this complex of inferiority was never the case for Ukraine, but they were trying to cherish this inferiority complex. And a very important page of our history reflects this, and that's what Taras Shevchenko always was striving to fight against. And we need to think of that. But as far as your question is concerned, it seems to me that it's difficult to speak now on how in our current conditions you can really give a well-balanced view of such claims of Ukraine.
I'll give you an example. In November, Rifat Chubarov, the head of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people, has once again stressed that there's a need to set up the national territorial autonomy of Crimean Tatars after the victory. And from time to time, Crimean Tatars are raising this issue, but it often is met with, to put it mildly, not much understanding. And they are being suspected in separatist tendencies. And there's a popular narrative that Ukraine has to be absolutely unitarian state, and this, to my mind, shows that we haven't experienced colonial oppression and all this stuff that comes from it, have not yet understood or accepted to the full extent that other peoples have the same right to self-determination within the territory of Ukraine. The more so that Crimean Tatars and the Krimchaks and the Karaim are indigenous people, and they do not have any other country apart from this country. So your comment.
Звичайно, тут взагалі питання про поняття.
That's the issue of notions. Philosophers always come to an agreement what they mean by a specific notion. For example, the notion of federation has been compromised in a way when we speak about the Russian Federation, which is in no way the federation by its essence. We can state that we have federal order in the federative order in the Federal Republic of Germany because they autonomous lands there. These are incomparable things. But now I've come to better understand what you meant by your question. Well, of course, these autonomies, to a certain extent, should be taken into account. And I think that we have got quite a good connection between such reputable people from the Crimean Tatars as Mustafa Jamilov or Rafat Chuvarov. I think that these things, after all the presentation, all the events that have been taking place, and after our victory and after peace is settled, I am sure that these issues will be raised and will be settled. At least effort will be taken to do this. Probably I'm looking at all this through some rosy spectacles, but it seems to me that this settlement will not be a difficult thing to do.
I'll just shortly say, well, there's a difference between kind of post-colonial situation and decolonized situation. And the post-colonial situation is where we kind of keep on the colonial structures, we just change the actors, or we just change the colors. For example, in Kazakhstan, we still have kind of these pioneer ties, but they are not red, they're blue, like our flag. And that's the typical post-colonial situation where the structures stay and kind of the ideas, for example, Soviet colonial ideas as titular nation, ethnic minorities, kind of this folklorized, ethnicized, depoliticized understanding of nation. It lives on with, instead of Russians, there are Kazakhs now. Decolonized situation would be, well, I'll just give an example of Kazakhstan, because we were kind of, the territory of Kazakhstan was a territory where a lot of people were deported during the Soviet times. So we have communities, Chechen or ethnic Germans, Poles, everyone actually. So the decolonized situation would be how to make sure that everyone feels equal belonging. So the challenge for us is really to get rid of the understanding of indigenous people. So every kind of place has different challenges. So, and decolonization is a political process, and it involves civic and political debates and discussions. It's a process of building institutions, values. It's a process of democratization, and it's difficult, but it's something that depends on us. It doesn't happen just like that. It can stay post-colonial, which means colonial, but with different colors. Decolonial, and I think that Ukraine has been, except for the Baltic states, of course, one that has made a lot of steps to decolonize. And I hope that that's why I always plead for a lot of the discussions to take place in Ukraine.
Thank you, David.
Я теж спочатку думав, я не зрозумів питання, зараз його розумію. Як ви нагадали цей
But now I
приклад.
understand it, and when you gave the example of Crimean Tatars. And when I have the external look of Ukraine, I can see that Ukraine is a democratic state, which means that the minorities' will is taken into account in spite of the fact that the will of the majorities is expressed. And unlike totalitarian states, democratic countries are not imposing their policy through some strengths, using their power. So as long as Ukraine stays democratic, you cannot consider yourself to be a new empire. It seems to me that you are just going through the tragedies, through the tragic process, and it seems to me that you will never want to become what these former colonialists were like. And I think that respect for minorities, ethnic, religious, or sexual minorities, is something that is already there in Ukraine. You have this level of tolerance when you take into account their rights. So I don't have any doubt that you will become a European democratic country with different forms of autonomies or delegation of power to lower levels with this decentralization reform ongoing. So I don't think that this is an issue that would be important to consider.
Russia was regarded as a beacon of democracy on the post-Soviet space, except the Baltic states, of course. And many people, including Ukraine, were admiring Boris Yeltsin and his words addressed to different so-called republics within Russia: take as much power as you can sustain. However, it quickly turned back. Why, from your point of view? Was it inevitable, or was it that the KGB, FSB, or other entities have just in time seen that the further development in this vein would be detrimental to Russia as the remnants of the empire? Andriy Dakhniy.
Yes, I think that we should talk here about a very long historical path Russia undertook. This path was difficult to connect to the democratic forms of rule and democratic values. We can see it very clearly. We had Alexander II in the 19th century who was trying to make reforms, but several times there were attempts at murder. And then we know 1917, from February to October, there was the reform process. So we know some attempts, some periods in the Russian history when people were trying to make reforms, and normally these reforms ended up in a very sad way, in a fiasco, in a failure. And what happened in the Gorbachev and Yeltsin period, I think, Andriy, we should distinguish Yeltsin before 1996 and after 1996. This late Yeltsin was much more authoritarian and much more prone to take care of the interests of the family. And as we know it perfectly well, it was the family that actually raised the candidacy of this FSB colonel for the position of the president. And we remember how happy they were when he won in the first round. There is the so-called Vitaly Mansky's film, which illustrates this very well. So the experience of democracy in Russia was very short, and the establishment of Russia always relies on the fact that this country, this empire, could not exist as one whole when any democratic forms of rule were used. And that leads to kind of deconcentration and weakening of the country, and leads to the decay of the country. And then the process was becoming stricter and tighter. And I still think that if we take early Yeltsin, there were some democratic reforms. It looked like democracy or pluralism, but then it started changing in the 200s. But I think that there are also many other things that need to be taken into account. In particular, this is the Western policy, which already in this period of this authoritarian model of Putin somehow treated this and responded to this in a very mild way. Of course, that is the will of the Russian people that appear to be very much yielding and to the official policy, and well, there were no rallies almost, but for one, which ended up in no reform. But in fact, I think that the whole situation was affected not only by the weakness of Yeltsin, but by the Western policy as well. And we should take into account some phantomic pains Russians had. But unfortunately, this facing Putin as a democratic leader and the Obama's policy, who also trusted in the so-called reloading of relationship with Russia. So a lot depends not only on the country itself, but on the views. And a lot of people in the West somehow didn't see this, or maybe there were some other factors involved. But anyway, the set of factors really worked. And now it looks that Russia has become not just as an authoritarian, but a totalitarian state, in particular after the amendments in the constitution and after February 2022, it has become obvious.
Anyone wants to chip in and develop? Yes. And please, oh yeah, very, very good. But after David.
Так, тут дуже хочу підтримати цю тезу, що
I would like to support the statement that there are multiple other factors that need to be factored in, cultural, sociological. The West was very naive when they thought that 1989 would bring democracy to the entire post-Soviet space. And the colleagues could not really understand back then that there was this short stretch of so-called democracy in Russia, but it was associated with the economic weakness for Russia. So for them, democracy is a discredited idea that can be a source of weakness. There are some cultural factors that come into play here, so we need to consider how the Russians see themselves. They see themselves as a great nation, and here they are humiliated. So democracy for them equals humiliation. So that's how we can view democracy in Russia from the perspective of the West.
The mic is in the hands of the moderator.
Do you hear me? Yeah, sure. I'm from Ukrainian media, European Pravda. I cover European and foreign affairs, so my question is really addressed to our foreign participants. I would like to refer what David said about that colonialism is not mentioned in public discourse in the EU at least. So my question is, do you see that we should push this idea? Should we promote that? Because to me personally, I also not that much sure that it works. But can it work? Should we describe it? If we shouldn't, what kind of term we should better use instead of neocolonialism or post-colonialism when we describe Russia policy towards Ukraine? Thank you.
Anyone wants to start to answer? No? Could you please reformulate your question within one phrase?
Should Ukraine push the idea that Russian policy was and is colonial towards Ukraine? I mean, should we push it in dialogue with our foreign partners?
I can...
So how can Ukraine counteract the Russian imperialism, to put it briefly?
Well, I think there are already kind of narratives and voices who talk about it and have done a wonderful job explaining kind of Russian colonialism to the world, and much depends on what you put into that conversation. Just saying colonialism will not bring much, but it depends on kind of the dialogue and kind of the messages and kind of the learning experiences between regions and solidarities and connecting it to a decolonial process of learning to listen to each other, holding conversation not through metropolitan centers, but having these other connections with people from regions who have also colonial experience. I think it's a very unique moment in history where these conversations should take place, because this is kind of the moment where also kind of colonial experience in Europe will connect to colonial experiences in non-European places. And it's kind of the global dialogue that we need to raise, first of all, awareness about Russian colonialism, but second of all, to think about kind of global issues. For example, I work on with scholars on Chinese colonialism, and we have also, genocide in China as well going on. So I think that it is a unique opportunity. Much depends on how we go into this conversation. But I think yes, it is necessary.
Thank you. Any other questions? David, yes.
Залежить. Наприклад, дуже добре, що зараз ваш міністр закордонних справ в Африці. Там треба говорити.
Foreign affairs is in Africa right now because there is a need for talking about the colonial experience and decolonization process, because basically you are undergoing some similar processes like they did in Africa. With European countries, it's different. And I would like to reminisce two situations with my French colleagues. I had one boss, and when he came to Ukraine, we recommended that he actively comment on the developments and events in Ukraine. He was French, by the way, but he had this complex of neocolonialism, and he said, we are not an empire, we will not going to do that, but we told him, but Russia is doing that. So he just said, we are not them. That was back in 2015, 2016. Several months ago, I went to Brussels, and my former French colleague, supervisor, in 2014, he called upon Ukraine to be even-minded and not to provoke Russia. And I was surprised by what he said in Brussels. What Russia is doing to Ukraine right now can be compared with us, France, occupying parts of Algeria right now. It would be the same if we forced Algeria to join us, and that's after decades when they separated from us. So basically, he started comparing the former French colonial policy with the Russian current colonial policy. So once again, it is contingent on specific countries. We need to emphasize the commonalities between the ongoing Russian policy and fascism. For example, in some countries, you need to focus on the commonalities of these two ideologies. So basically, you will not really use neocolonial references in some of the countries because they don't really have their own experience of struggle against fascism, for example.
May I? Пан Андрію. Yuri Zalizniak, Ivan Franko National University of Lviv. First of all, I would like to thank you, Andriy Dakhniy, for mentioning Grigory Skovoroda, and I would like also to drag your attention to Feofan Prokopovich in terms of his role in establishment of Russian or former Moscow Empire into Russian Empire. In 1980s, Jerome Bruner wrote a book, Actual Minds, Possible Words. It's a social psychology book, and in terms of transformation of possible words into actual minds, how using some words we establish new minds, actually new world. In terms of interaction between empire, metropoly, and colony. Sometimes when members of colony are just keep naming empire as a metropoly, even despite the fact that it's not metropoly in terms of Russia, as we mentioned already with the Ukrainian inequity of Ukrainian culture.
The question is?
And the question is, maybe we should more talk about ourselves than with possible words establish actual empire, as it was not an empire, as it was not a primary culture, because then we will be secondary and we just doing something wrong in terms of our perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes left for this panel, so please, your answers should be brief. And the next person to ask the question will be the gentleman in the third row. So who wants to answer? Probably Mr. Dakhniy, as he was the one who mentioned Skovoroda and who deserved all the praise.
Насправді тут завжди треба диференціювати. Я думаю, ви, Юрію, дуже добре згадали.
I think that we need to differentiate here. You referred to Fan Propakovich, also Stepan Yavorsky, Bezborodko, the Chancellor of Catherine II. These are the issues that we have already briefly touched upon. So this legacy of inferiority. And the Ukrainians actively contributed to the establishment of the Russian Empire. That said, this narrative is deeply entrenched. You might remember that Dovzhenko once wrote, "Our miserable history is determined by our inconvenient and unhappy geography, because we find ourselves in the vicinity of such a powerful country. So it's only natural that some people are tempted to get adjusted, especially in this colonial regime." And we had some high-ranking intellectuals in Ukraine that did a lot for the empire. Now, Ukraine has a unique chance. Well, actually, we received that chance back in the 1990s. One more statement. There's a big difference between post-colonialism and anti-colonialism. The 1990s, the early 2000s, we were part of this post-colonial world. Lenin monuments, national fighters for national liberation, and average Ukrainians perceived these things as granted. And then a completely different situation unraveled after 2014. Decommunization, de-Sovietization, it all started in the late 2000s. And then even 2010s. And after 2022, Ukraine marked itself on the world map, because before that, it was perceived in the shadow of Russia.
Because we're running out
Good
of
morning,
time.
everyone. Firstly, I want to answer my colleagues that have a question before me. If something look like colonialism, moving like colonialism, and smell like colonialism, it's colonialism. You don't need to find another definition for this. But my question is from the another side. If we must to say about Russian colonialism and colonialism or democracy at all, maybe it's more honest will be say that that is not as a fact, it's a process. And that was our Czech colleague said that in Central Europe, they don't feel that Soviet Union was a colonial state for them, because they think that Czech and Slovak Republic, that Poland, it's puppet states, but states. And Ukraine in this world was just a part of the Soviet Union. So the policy for these sides, it will be different, because it's different process, different interaction between the actors.
The question is?
Is it right to say about colonialism as a fact, or better said that colonialism it's a policy, it's a during process for many, many years with different cases?
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left, so I would ask every participant to answer this question and make some summing up remarks within those 5 minutes. Each one of you has a minute. Botakoz.
Yes. Historians usually look at it as a process, as a system, and as a structure. It's very often one falls into what I call individual fallacy, explaining colonialism through actors, but one really needs to look at it as a structure and as a process. It's very important to understand it because it will provide different answers for our struggle to decolonize. So yes, I agree. It's you can look at it as a process and as a structure.
Thank you, Andriy.
Деколонізація, звичайно, це дуже важке завдання.
Decolonization is a formidable task indeed, and this is something that the world will not be able to do within 1 year. Some radical and significant steps are already being made in this regard, and hopefully these processes will be accelerated. But there are certain things that are difficult to change, especially for the representatives of the older generation. Andriy, I remember one of your ideas that you articulated 10 to 15 years ago. You said that in Ukraine, we need a Russian language channel that would present a pro-Ukrainian stance. So we didn't really have such a channel in the east of Ukraine, and as a result, the east of Ukraine was shaped by the Russian propaganda, and this event also played a crucial role in the events unraveling right now. I'm not an academician, so I can answer this question, but only from the perspective of my personal experience. We need to have a look whether these parts of colony have an understanding of subjectivity or objectivity. I think that you, as Ukraine, understand that you have agency. And I would like to have a comparison with Belarus. The society in Belarus is divided, and even when you are conversing with the representatives of the opposition, they say, we need to decide our future in Moscow. And I always respond, why can't you take initiative into your own hands? Because it's difficult. So this is part of their mentality and mindset. They are an object. So there's this element of objectivity there. And we had something similar in Central Europe. We had fake states controlled by the communists. And for a long time, the societies hushed things down. They were silent. But then over time, the sense of agency was shaped, and people realized that they could determine their own future. I think that you have already finalized and completed this process, the process of exiting the empire, but there are some other nations, some other societies that are still in the area of influence by Russia. They're not really there yet. They haven't really achieved that level of awareness. They are still an object, but unfortunately, not everyone has this understanding.
From what our panelists have said was Mr. Dakhniy's, or Dr. Dakhniy's, phrase when he started to say, and after the inevitable, and I mentally continued, defeat of the Russian Empire, but he said, and after the inevitable victory. And this is very indicative. Even in such harsh times, we tend to think positive. I'm grateful to you for this. And my final question to every one of you is, well, I was mistaken when I thought that you would say defeat. And what do you think will be the most pleasant surprise for you when one of your predictions does not materialize? Where would you like to be mistaken? Andriy Dakhniy, 30 seconds.
Андрій Дахній. Очевидно, я хотів би помилятися в тому, що
I would like to be mistaken about something that is a little bit off the topic. It has to do with the sustainability of Putin's Russia in the economic domain in the first place. What unraveled in 2022, we had this idea that Russia had clay feet, but we can see that it's still strong and robust. But I really hope that Russia will turn out to be this monster of beast on clay feet. David? I would like to be mistaken about two things that I'm skeptical about. I don't really believe that there's democracy in Russia. I really hope that I'm wrong. And I hope that I'm mistaken about the collective West not understanding Russia. I really hope that I'm wrong here and that the West will understand the true face of Russia.
Botakoz Kassymbekova.
I really join both of you, and I also hope that I'm mistaken that the kind of subjectivization, political subjectivization that you were talking about, that it is not an impossible thing for Russians.
A round of applause for Ms. Kassymbekova. Thank you very much. We're right on time, 11 o'clock, and what a lot has been said. Thank you.